I'm glad that you said it's for all the religions
It is.
because our Temple Mount, it says in Isaiah that it's supposed to be a place of prayer for the nations.
There was something about Jerusalem that makes you feel as if God is everywhere. We've made it so much about the Jews that we forgot we should be talking about Israelis, which encompass lots of different kinds of people.
Yes.
Who's to blame if someone innocent dies? The person who put them in front. They put their operations in hospitals, schools, in community centers. What are you expecting?
Yes. And also, what are people expecting when war happens? Welcome back to another episode of the Black and Jewel podcast. I have a very, very special guest with me today. She is the member of the Florida House of Representatives, Representative Vicki Lopez. Hi,
Ashira.
Vicki.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you today about a very significant trip to Israel. I'm looking forward to sharing with you my upfront and close experiences.
I'm so excited to hear about your trip to Israel. I want to start with before you went to Israel. So, as you know, in America, we have a lot of turmoil going on about support for Israel, don't support Israel, don't send aid, send aid. We have tons of pro-Israel voices, anti-Israel voices. Where do you stand politically?
So I've been unapologetically pro-Israel from the very day I got elected. And my history with the Jewish community, it kind of goes way back. As a child, I would read every book about the Holocaust. I have no idea what interested me to begin that journey, but I'd read books that most Jews haven't read about that terrible period, that very dark period in the history of the world. And so I have always had Jewish friends, always felt very close to the Jews. And so when I get elected, one of the first bills I filed was a bill to make anti-Semitism a hate crime. I was very disturbed by what appeared in those. I got elected in November of 2022, and I had begun to see anti-Semitic behavior in our state. And I thought, where's this coming from and why? And, I had been introduced to the rabbis of the Rock Shul, which is a very large Chabad shul in my district. And, they had been very supportive. They do great work in my community. And so it just felt like a natural thing to do to help to protect and defend my Jewish constituency. And so it would have been a natural step for me to take a trip to Israel.
Tell me a little bit about, you said you didn't understand where this anti-Semitism was coming from in the state of Florida. Did you ever kind of dig into it and get a sense of why it started to rise?
Well, I think that sometimes politics feeds into it, as it did in the early 30s in Europe. Somehow someone decides that, maybe it's deep rooted anti-Semitism in families, maybe it's in the political process. But I do think that it's always been about, ignorance. I've been a real proponent. One of the gifts that I and three other House members gave everyone on the last day of session this year was the Jewish Book of Knowledge. I've worked very closely with the Department of Education to try to put that book into the curriculum. And how did I get to that book? Well, I was speaking to a rabbi of the United Nations, and he was asking me, so what does your curriculum look like in the state of Florida? And I said, we have an extensive Holocaust curriculum that I'm very proud of. And he goes, oh, so in other words, you're teaching children how Jews die. Wow. How about teaching them how they live?
That's an impactful statement.
No, it was a huge statement to me, who had always been a defender of the Jews. So it occurred to me, and then I was introduced to the book, the Jewish Book of Knowledge, which really does talk about the richness of the Jewish people, their culture, how they live. And so I have connected those people with the Department of Education in hopes that we can include how Jews live, because I believe that I think education and knowledge is very important. And I believe, like in any situation that might be negative, like racism, once you understand who you're talking about, it's hard to be against them, right? I mean, as a group of people, for instance, so I've been a fighter against racism. I'm a Hispanic woman. I've had to fight that, people thinking that Hispanics are one way when in fact we are a multitude of many different Hispanic cultures. So for me, it's all about talking about who they are, talking about, how they act and how they interact with us is one way of really decreasing the amount of anti-Semitism. So I set about to using my position to really say, first, we won't accept any of this in our state. You can't make people fearful. There's a big difference between the First Amendment of freedom of speech and then inciting violence against people. And the way the bill ended up was it was about inciting violence against anyone, right? Because certainly my Black colleagues said, what about us?
Yes.
And that is an important conversation to have, right? It's not just violence against Jews. It's violence against any group of people should never be tolerated in our state.
Yes.
And so that was a very exciting sort of moment for me where I could really stand up for all people, no matter who you are. We're not going to allow this kind of incitement of violence to be, make anyone a victim, right?
For the education of the viewers watching this, can you just give a little bit of a snippet of what is the difference between, the freedom of speech and what you can say and inciting violence? Because we see particularly, I'm also Republican. We see on the right wing side, everything is about freedom of speech, no censorship, but our First Amendment does not allow us to, incite violence. So I think people just need to understand, okay, well, what does that mean practically?
So that's a really good point, because I was criticized by the far right for having advanced this bill. And honestly, look, you can stand on a street corner and say anything you want to say, right? What you cannot do, and what was happening in Florida, was one, defacing private property without the permission of the owner. Right. I remember seeing a sort of a lighted swastika on the side of a building, and no one had been given permission to do that. Right. We were also experiencing where they were throwing flyers, actually entering into people's private property to put a flyer at their door that was with an anti-Semitic message. So now you've trespassed into someone's private property. So. And then there was a call for violence, right? In other words, not keeping your space. There were Jews that were leaving the synagogue and were being accosted by anti-Semitic, activity right in their face. Now, there's a difference between you standing on the street corner and expressing your views, very freely, versus now getting in front of somebody, violating their personal space, violating personal property, also trespassing, and then calling for violence, right, as part of your message.
Yeah.
So there is a very clear line between your ability to be free to speak versus your ability to now move into someone's space or property.
Thank you for that explanation. That was very, very clear. Talk to me about the demographics of your district. Is it predominantly Jewish, Hispanic, Black, a nice mix?
Yeah, no, actually, I don't have very many Black constituents.
Okay.
So because I represent the urban area, but it's not the urban area. I have a colleague, a Democrat Black colleague, who represents more of what you would consider the Black community.
Okay.
Right. So I don't have a lot. What I do have is Black professionals, because I represent the financial district, the downtown area, Brickell, Key Biscayne, Coconut Grove. And then I have obviously Black Hispanics, because I have Little Havana as part of my district. I would say the vast majority, about 75% of my district, is Hispanic.
Okay.
And that makes sense because I have Little Havana, I have the roads, I have Key Biscayne, where we've had an influx of a lot of Hispanic population coming from South and Central America that are leaving countries that have been taken over by dictators or socialism or communism, right? So they traditionally have moved here. And I've also had others move during the pandemic into my district that were Hispanic as well. So if you speak Spanish, your chances of moving to Miami are greater than anywhere else. So yes.
Within your district, do you see a lot of anti-Semitism. How is the Hispanic and Jewish communities getting along?
So they get along really well.
Okay.
I have 3 Jewish communities in my district, 2 Chabads, one on Key Biscayne, one in Brickell, and then I have a Beth David is another larger synagogue, more reform.
Okay.
So I have a lot of Jewish constituents. A lot of them are young professionals, believe it or not.
Okay.
Young families that are starting.
So are
out.
they aged from like 25 to 34?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or, there's a
to
good,
40. I don't know.
There is
Where
a
are we
good
young?
amount. Yeah, I don't even know anymore, right? Because
Yeah.
I consider myself young, but by age maybe not. But I do think that Hispanics traditionally are more conservative, and they feel very rooted in their support of Israel, thus in support of my Jewish constituency, which I think is very interesting.
Okay.
And I also believe, because many of the Hispanics are Christian, the Christian faith has always been supportive of our Jewish brothers and sisters. So I think that it's just a natural tendency to want to be supportive.
Okay. I really like that. So you went to Israel recently.
I did.
You went with the Miami Federation, and they took legislators there. You were there for 10 days, but the trip they booked was for 7 days. And I want to hear all about your experience. So as soon as you land, what do you feel?
Okay, so I first want to say how grateful I am to not only the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, but to the Broward Federation and the Palm Beach Federation. It was a wonderful South Florida trip, right? And I say that because we have the second largest Jewish population outside of New York in the South Florida area. So it was wonderful to kind of coalesce with the 2 other federations that I don't get a chance to meet with and talk with often as I do with the Greater Miami one. But we went early. There was several of us that went early.
Okay.
Because we wanted to sort of get the lay of the land. And we went with a lobbyist whose cousin is in the Israeli Defense Forces.
Okay.
And who had been part of the rescue of the 4 hostages
Wow.
2 weeks before that.
Wow.
So we had an opportunity to really see Tel Aviv, if you will, with her perspective, right? So Erica's cousin's name is Jennifer, and Jennifer speaks obviously fluent Hebrew. So we felt very much at home with her guidance, if you will, but with her experience about what was it like. What are the people saying on the ground? What are the soldiers saying that she, communes with? So that was really an interesting 3 days. And we were excited to see the schedule, because the schedule was extensive. We were not resting. Once the crew arrived, there was no rest. That would have been.
You slept when you got home.
Yeah, exactly, because it was meant to be an intense trip. And I have to say, we started in the south. We were in Tel Aviv for a couple of days, and then we went south to the kibbutzim, Naraz, where the first group of Hamas actually crossed the fence. And we met with a gentleman whose family was in fact saved, and saved by his wife's intuition. And by that I mean approximately a couple of months before October 7th, she told him to purchase a lock for the safe room in their home. And, everyone who knows anything about Israel knows that at any moment you might hear a siren, you might have to run to a safe shelter. In the homes, there's always a safe room. It's usually the children's room, so you don't have to wake them and move them. And so, it's meant to be somewhat of a bomb shelter, if you will, right?
Yep.
No one expected ever that they would be attacked on foot. But somehow she had this sixth sense. And so he went out and bought a lock, which they installed inside the children's room. And so that very fateful morning of October 7th, they hear the sirens, they get up from their room, they go into the children's room, she locks the door.
Wow.
And shortly thereafter, obviously, we know the terror that ensued at that kibbutzim. The Hamas was pulling at the door. Hamas was able to get into everyone's safe shelter in that kibbutzim except theirs, because the lock did not permit them to open the door. And so they set the home on fire, Hamas did. And it melted the rubber lining of the door. And so smoke began to, kind of come into the room. And there they were faced with, my God, we may die of smoke inhalation. There's always one window in the safe room, but it's covered by a metal door. he was left with no choice. The father was left with no choice but to open it randomly each and every time the smoke got too much, despite the fact Hamas was right outside in the courtyard where their window was. So they had to make a conscious decision, either die of smoke inhalation or take our chances they don't see the window opening and closing. And of course they did not. And of course they survived. Our tour through that kibbutzim was very, very hard and difficult, because you can see the children's things, their toys, their shoes thrown all over the place, right? You can see the terror. You can almost feel the terror based on the environment that we were observing. And for me, that was just too much, because, I've always been a defender of children and the elderly, and to know that they were terrorized this morning. On the door of each of the hostages that was taken from that kibbutzim is a picture of them. You have to assume that on the doors that don't have a picture, someone died, or they were like this family that were saved. But it was harrowing going to the community center and seeing the glass, the bullet holes. I mean, they were getting ready for their Jewish holiday, the Sukkot, and so they were getting ready. They were putting out the, almost the meals, etc. So this was a moment in time where you can stand there for a moment, breathe in the terror that remains in the air. And I think that was so moving for everyone. And everyone was pretty quiet. I mean, it was hard, but it was necessary.
Yeah.
And then from there, we traveled to the music festival site. And I have to tell you that was even more harrowing, because it's just a rows and rows of pictures of young, innocent people that were having a good time, and unbeknownst to them, their lives were going to be cut short by terrorists who were arriving on foot. And, it's interesting. We had an opportunity to speak to a gentleman who had actually saved 750 of them. He actually got a call. He still has the text messages of all of the parents that began to call, because his number was shared with everyone. It started trending. And honestly, he got a call in the morning from one of his friends that said, "My son is at the music festival. Do you think you can go and save him? He'll drop the location." And he didn't hesitate. I find this so amazing about people who live in Israel. They're so accustomed to having their lives on the line 24/7, 7 days a week. He didn't hesitate for the call to save somebody. He went and he picked up, he found 12 people that were running. He picked them up, took them home, and then called all of his friends and family and said, "We need help." And they didn't hesitate, right? And so when they're coming, they do find his friend's son, and he just kept going back. He put himself and all of his family and neighbors and friends, those lives were all put at risk to try to save these kids. And he was a farmer, so he knew all the back roads.
Yeah.
You gotta see how God plays into this whole story.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost impossible that miracles of this magnitude can happen without the hand of God showing itself. But what was more incredible was the last person that he saved was a young girl that was already in the hands of 8 Hamas. Since he had worked in the Gaza Strip, he knew Arabic perfectly without an accent. And he says to them, "The IDF is behind us. Let me have her. I'll take her to Gaza. You guys run."
Wow.
They released her into his hands. And honestly, he's a hero. He's an Israeli hero, but really, quite frankly, he turned into our hero.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people would have done what he did without thinking. And the worst part for him was when he got to the really central part of the music festival and he could see all the bodies and the destruction that Hamas had, really demonstrated it could do to innocent people.
Did you watch the 47-minute video?
I did.
Okay.
I did watch that before I left. So
Okay.
I had really, quite frankly, I thought it was almost, kind of interesting that I would have seen that before I left, because it gave me a point of reference. I could, seeing the video of all the cell phones gave me an impression of where I was.
Oh.
So it really was very moving for me. In particular, there was a group of police, Israeli police officers. I guess they're doing these tours so that they know what they're up against, what really happened. I think that was telling as well. But that was a very difficult day. I think it was emotionally exhausting, physically exhausting. And honestly, it set the stage for what the week would bring.
Vicki, as you know, I live in Israel and I was there on October 7th. And I'm just getting emotional hearing you speak about what you saw because I went to Kibbutz Be'eri. And when you said what was the hardest part was seeing that the children's lives, you seen their clothes, their books, and blood and all kinds of things in a child's room. And so I just like you took me back to that moment. What I'm having a hard time understanding was the response from the international community to deny this type of atrocity. Why do you think so many people on October 7th first stood with Israel, and then by October 8th, October 9th, October 10th, rapes never happened, children didn't die. This is resistance. Hamas is a resistance group. Why do you think so many people are duped into believing that a terrorist organization is actually a resistance group because they're being oppressed and therefore they can justify this type of atrocity and in the same breath deny the atrocity?
You know, that is an incredible situation. I'm listening to you say it and I'm thinking, how crazy does all of that sound?
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a new story. I think this dates back to 1948 when Israel first sort of became a place where Jews could go. And I don't know that people know enough about the history of Israel to understand how we got here in the first place, right? I mean, every Jew in Europe was practically, killed. And those that survived were looking for home. And they made their way to what they think is the biblical, right of life, if you will, and the right of birth, to go and form this state so that they would have a state where they would always be safe. Because it was clear that they weren't safe anywhere in Europe, clearly, due to the extermination of over 6 million Jews. And so there was already a tussle in 1948, right? And there have been tussles ever since. We've never settled the question of whether or not Israel has a right to that land and whether or not Palestinians do they even have a state? That's recently come up with them competing in the Olympics. What state do they represent? Right? What country do they represent? So this is sort of a continuation of a story that has never been resolved. And I got a great history of sort of the Israel, conflicts in that region and the negotiations that have taken place over the years, but it's never been settled.
Never.
So, it's interesting. What is more interesting is not the response in the Middle East, right? Because they're living it and have lived it since 1948, right? So no resolution means there's always a conflict.
Yep.
I think what's surprising is what we're seeing in Europe and America.
Yes.
I am, for the life of me, am trying to understand how, and I don't actually, I'm not surprised by Europe. I believe there was always sort of an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, feeling, because the history of Europe was that. So you can almost understand that, right? You can almost say, oh, they've gone back to the early 1930s again. They've never changed their mind.
Yes, you can make it make sense.
You can make it make sense because so many people collaborated with the Nazis.
Yes.
Governments and people,
yes.
Right? But America, for God's sakes, I mean, we fought the Nazis. We engaged in a world war because it was wrong what they were doing, right? So I think the question mark, and it's a question mark you hear from Israelis, what's happening in America that would make you all sound a different kind of an alarm?
Yeah.
The alarm is for the Palestinian people, not for the Israelis. And we did have a ceasefire on the evening of October 6th. And I always say to everyone, make no mistake, the Israelis went to bed that night not fighting anyone. And it was Shabbat. So let's remember that too. It's a religious time where they rest. They weren't fighting anyone, and yet they woke up to complete terror and evil. And yet, as you correctly point out, the first response from everyone is, oh my God, this is terrible. And then all of a sudden there's what I call those voices, the voices of the past. And they began to become louder. And then all of a sudden, young people who know nothing about the history of Israel or that area of the Middle East somehow took up, arms, if you will, figuratively, against Israel. And I to this day tell people I don't understand it.
Yeah.
Because, and I always use America as the example. When the World Trade Towers fell, we didn't stop at anything to find Osama bin Laden, and I mean anything.
Yes,
we would have killed everybody in the way, and probably did, because we were looking for that one enemy, Osama bin Laden, and we didn't stop until we found him.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Though nobody in the world said America's a terrible place. No one said America doesn't have a right to defend itself. No one said anything. Actually, everyone remained outraged and fearful of terrorist groups like that Osama bin Laden was leading. But it's always different when it comes to Israel.
Yep.
And I believe that it has always been somewhat of an anti-Semitic thread that runs deep and that rises when it comes to Israel.
Do you think here in America we will ever, get out of this oppressed and oppressor binary argument? Because that's what we have going on here in America, and then they have now applied that narrative or lens, if you will, to Israel, and it doesn't work there. Here in America, it's the white man is the oppressor and the black person is oppressed, or throw in whatever minority group, even though Jewish people are a minority, because they're successful, they can't be oppressed. So we just have this binary way of looking at things and then view the whole entire world that way. But here specifically, also Israel, are we ever going to move forward out of that?
Well, and I think that traces our roots to racism. I mean, honestly, I think this oppressor-oppressed narrative is longstanding, as is the Israeli conflict in the Middle East, right? So in other words, we have a history of the oppressed and the oppressor. It changes in America. Sometimes it's Hispanics, sometimes it's blacks, now it's Jews. We pick people. I find it so distressing in 2024 that we're still talking about oppression, period.
Yeah.
Period. No matter who it is.
Yep.
That I am still having to have a conversation about who's oppressed.
Yes.
Listen, I have friends of every walk in life, of every color, creed, nationality. I don't see it anymore, right? I don't dismiss that there are pockets of injustice. That I do understand, right? Which led to the Black Lives Matter movement. Listen, there's injustice everywhere in the world. I don't know that we're ever going to cure that. But the narrative you're talking about, where we have an oppressor, or as they like to say in the Middle East and elsewhere, we've got colonialist, people that have colonized people. I mean, I can hardly think that fits the Israel story, right?
Yes.
Because
I always say colonized from where? We didn't go and make like a little Germany. So like,
correct. Where were they from? They were from everywhere.
Yes. And why in Israel do they speak their original language of Hebrew? Like, part of colonization, you take over the culture, you take over the language. You know what I mean?
But I do believe that there is this belief amongst those that are somewhat pro-Palestinian, that in fact that land has never belonged to Israel. That's the longest standing argument we're going to always have. And until that really gets resolved, and look, we've thought it's been resolved several times already. There have been wars, there have been land given, boundaries drawn. It's never over. Yeah. And I think that makes it different. The American story of oppressor and oppressed really is getting old, I think, because I'm sitting here as a Hispanic woman, you're a Black woman, and here we are, we're highly successful, highly educated. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone in our culture is, but we've taken advantage of the American dream, if you will, and we have educated ourselves and we've become successful women. From the looks of it, you would think, wow, how did they make it? But we're not unique.
No.
We're not the exception anymore.
No.
Well, I have plenty of Black, Hispanic men and women who are now like me. We've got lots of women in the House of Representatives. We have blacks, Hispanics, white people, we all try to get along because it's for the good of the order, if you will.
Yeah.
I think whoever is continuing this narrative is because it's convenient for them.
It's convenient to have
really
this division.
It's really convenient to their story,
yeah,
or what they're trying to accomplish. So it's the me versus the greater good. And we've got to fight against that. And I think you and I have a responsibility to fight against it because we're the minorities.
Yes.
Right. So I'm sitting here fighting it as we speak.
Yeah.
That I don't feel, I've always had opportunity. I've taken advantage of those opportunities. I've worked very hard to get to where I'm at. And that is the same opportunity that's afforded to everyone.
I had a rabbi tell me, Ashira, you're Black, you're Jewish, and you're Republican. Why would you make your life so hard? And I said, well, two of them I can't change, and I won't be changing my political party anytime soon. And who cares? Like, I have had things afforded to me, like education, that my ancestors have not. And I've made it. And like you said, we're not the exception, and we're not unique. I don't feel unique in that. I feel that there are a lot of people who are smart in this country who are both Black and Hispanic, Jewish, whatever minority group you fall into, check the box. And you just need to take the opportunities that are in front of you and make something of your life.
Well, and I also think the Jews have a unique distinction. What occurred in Europe is occurring again now. Jews have been very successful. Let us just face the facts.
Yes, in America.
Well, and in Europe. And
yes.
What happened in Europe was jealousy. If you weren't successful, you had to find someone to blame.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Hitler did a really good job convincing everyone that the reason that they were having a difficult time was because of the Jews. Now, can you well imagine the Jews were, in fact, the business people. They were the ones hiring people. They're the ones that were keeping the economy going. But you see, that's all it took. All it took was to convince the masses that what ails you is because of the Jews. It's happening again.
We have that same story in America.
Yes.
It's because of X. It's because of the white man. It's always someone else.
Right. And so in other words, instead of becoming responsible for your own lot in life, if you will, we want to blame somebody else. And
it's easier.
It's much easier. And then that creates critical mass thinking, which is also dangerous, because I say to everybody, don't believe everything you read, don't believe everything you see. Inform yourself and then make informed choices, right? This mass hysteria that we see here, especially with people that aren't Palestinians, right? Like I can appreciate and be sensitive to someone who is either from one of the countries in the Middle East. I'm listening to their stories too.
Yes.
Because I think there are two sides to every story.
Yes.
I think what I worry about is the uninformed that are just hoisting a Palestinian flag, and you ask them why, and they can't tell you why.
And they don't know what river and what sea.
Correct.
I heard someone say from the river to the sea and the mountains. And I'm like, well, what mountains?
Yeah, no. And which river? And that is a good point. I think it's been a very, it's easy to want to be a part of a movement. Very easy. And I also often caution people, be careful about the movement, because who's leading it, what's their purpose, and what do you know about them?
Yeah.
Before you need to belong, you need to know yourself. You need to really be comfortable with who you are. You don't have to be a part of any movement as long as you know who you are and where you're standing and what you believe in.
Yes.
So,
what I hear you saying is, sounds like people and young people in America, they're not rooted in an identity and values and personal principles. Well,
it may be. We've shifted. I blame the social media for a lot of this because, I grew up at a time where there were only 3 TV stations and no one was giving their opinion about anything. You got the facts. You made your own opinions about what you were learning or hearing. I think that now I look at social media and anyone's a journalist. Anyone can say anything and it's fact. I think that's dangerous.
Yeah.
I think it's been very dangerous for young people. Because there's just too much information, and there is an overload of information on the internet. So what do you believe? And if you truly feel somewhat isolated, or you don't belong, or you don't feel good about yourself, you might latch on to some of these groups and not even know why.
Yeah.
Which is really sad, because so many of the kids that protested on college campuses did so by trespassing on property. Let's start there. And then they were shocked when they were expelled. And then university presidents shocked when they were fired. I mean, there has to be law and order. And I think that was what frightened me most. That groups of young people thought they could just set up camp on property that they did not own. Just because.
You know,
there's
out of
no
complete
respect.
ignorance.
This is what I'm saying. You have to respect other people's property. Now, you could have written letters. You could
and you can protest.
You could have protested. You know, peaceful protest.
Peaceful protest.
But this turned into like you harassing Jewish students.
Yeah.
To the point where Jewish families now will not send their children to the Ivy League, despite the fact that they've been accepted to an Ivy League school. They're having to forego that education because it's not safe.
I thought it was completely asinine that Columbia University told Jewish students to go home because we cannot protect you.
Yeah. Okay. Now, that was the exact opposite message I would have given. Yeah. I would have said, those that cannot behave, here are our rules. If you cannot follow them, you're the one going home.
Yeah.
I know.
I'm spending thousands of dollars to go to school, and you're saying I can't go to my classroom?
Right. No, but here's the problem. You see, authority then gave them credence.
Mm.
When you send home the victim and you don't punish the perpetrator, what you're doing is empowering the perpetrator. Truly, to make more victims. Because if there's no consequence, listen, when I was growing up, there was a cause and effect. There was always consequences to my behavior. Positive in some cases, negative in others. That's how I learned my lesson. That's how I learned to be a person who can live in society peacefully and willingly with many, many different people, because I was taught respect and character.
Yeah.
I don't know where we're at in America today.
Well, we have all this gentle parenting, but we could talk about that later.
Listen, I'm a conscious parent, but with boundaries.
Yes,
indeed.
Keyword boundaries.
Yes, everyone needs them.
Okay, take me back to your Israel trip. So you've seen the kibbutz, you met with families. What was the highlight of the trip? What was the feel-good part of the trip?
You know, the feel-good part of the trip was meeting young people. So we've just finished talking about some of the young people in America. I didn't meet anyone in Israel who's confused about who they are. I can tell you that. I was talking to 18-year-olds up to, 40, whoever was on the street that I could talk to, right? I was stunned by their level of maturity. I think that was so uplifting. People who don't have time to worry about what I think are insignificant issues in their lives, because guess what? These kids are on the front line. Everyone goes to the military. Everyone understands they have a responsibility to defend their country, their families, and themselves. There's just no room for worrying about some of the things that our kids worry about. And someone said to me, you know why your kids are the way they are and we're not? Because you've never been invaded.
Yep.
And it was really striking, because I thought, because we live a really good life in America. If not in America, then where would we go from here, right?
Right.
They are on call 24/7.
24/7.
Like, in other words, anything could happen at any given moment, and you have to stand up and defend.
Yes.
So, and I was also very mesmerized by their knowledge of their government. I bet you if I got 25 young kids in a room, they may not even know that I'm their state representative.
Right.
These people know who is who, what they stand for. They have opinions. They're well-versed, super informed. I was really, I thought, wow, this is a good thing. This is such a good thing, despite the fact that I'm sorry that they live under such conditions. Even the little ones know when the siren rings where you have to run.
Yes.
So it is a different culture. It is a different perspective.
Yes.
But it was inspiring, because my question is, what if we are invaded? Who's going to defend me?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have the answer to that.
Americans are not prepared. And to what you said, what I love about Israelis in terms of being so informed, I don't know if you noticed this, but when they have political discussions and they don't get along on opposite sides, they still go out and have coffee together.
Yes.
Like, they fight and yell and da-da-da. And, I love when they speak in Hebrew, because it just sounds more passionate than the English, because it's like, sounds really aggressive, but they could be saying something simple. And I studied abroad in Israel in 2016. And so I remember being in a classroom versus the classrooms in America, and they would yell at the teacher, and the professor would yell back, and there would be like this heated discussion, and then everyone would be like, okay, let's go to a Roma cafe and like have a coffee. And everyone was like, good. There was no like, you're a Democrat and you're a Republican, and now I'm going to be fake nice to you, but you can't be my friend.
Yeah.
In Israel,
No.
they get over it.
That.
Yeah.
No, you know why? Because they understand passionate discourse, but it's civil discourse.
Yes.
You know, in the end, it's civil.
Yes, in the end.
I think if you're looking at it, you think, geez, what's going on here, right? But they are so passionate about the politics around their country. And look, you know, listen, I met a lot of people that, you know, are challenged by this administration, by the Netanyahu administration.
Yes.
They don't particularly care for it, but it doesn't, in some way, in Israel, it doesn't in any way decrease their commitment to the cause.
They're still very patriotic.
It's so crazy.
Yes.
No, and I think the other thing that I really discovered, you know, when we talk about Israel, we talk about Jews, right?
Yeah.
And albeit they're the vast majority, but I met Bedouins, Druze, Christians, and Muslims, all who live in Israel, all who consider themselves Israeli, all who are as worried as the Jews that live in Israel about what the conflict could bring. And I think that we've missed that story somehow. We've made it so much about the Jews that we forgot we should be talking about Israelis, which encompass lots of different kinds of people.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I think that is the part that is missing in America when we talk about Israel.
Yes.
It's not lost in Israel because all of them have fought side by side with each other. So it's an interesting narrative that I came home with, which is we have to be very careful how we address this situation. It's not about the Jews, it's about Israelis. It's about Israel and her right to exist in that region.
Yes.
And that she's made up of a lot of different kinds of people that all, believe it or not, coexist peacefully.
Yes. Would you say that is the major misconception that Americans have about Israel, or is it something else?
That's one. That's one. I don't know that people know that. I don't know who they know. I don't know if they know. I also, you know, learned while I was in Israel that we have a lot of this technology because of the Israelis have been very, they've advanced technology. And I learned that like Google Maps and things like that come from the Bedouins who live in the desert and, you know, kind of send information to Israeli tech companies and to the government. So, you know, it's much richer than this conflict, you know, appears to be, right?
Yeah.
We know the conflict of Palestinians and Jews.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, actually, I think it's so much more than that. And this is what I'm saying when I say they don't get informed. I think every American needs to study the history of Israel, who lives in Israel, how did we get here, and how can we support the only ally we have in the Middle East for democracy.
Why should the U.S. support Israel?
It's very simple in my eyes. I mean, they're the only democratic state surrounded by Iran and its proxies, all of whom mean to keep us where we are in a very dangerous situation, right? So in other words, if Israel is fighting with us, if you will, then we have to support her.
Yep.
Because in fact, she's the low-hanging fruit. I might remind everyone who's listening, the mantra for the terrorists is death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews, and then victory for Islam.
Yep.
That is their sort of mantra. Every day they repeat it, they repeat it, they repeat it, and I would like them to realize that the first one is death to America. So it's
and we are big Satan, Israel's little Satan.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Iran has all these proxies around Israel, but she's aiming for us.
Yeah.
And already Hezbollah is in the Western Hemisphere. They're now situated in Venezuela. There's many Hezbollah soldiers that have come across the border. They have long-range missiles, you know, already in Venezuela. Listen, wake up. It's not just about Israel. It's about us. We are the infidels. And I saw this interesting video from the supreme leader of Iran that was telling his people that Allah is very upset with them. You know, imagine someone telling you your God is very upset with you and that he will remain upset and that there's no way to reconcile with Allah until we take over the world. Now, if that's the message, and I often like to say, amazing, right? Amazing that it would have to be that way. But that is their messaging. That is their narrative. So the critical mass that follows the supreme leader and all of the proxies believe that this is kind of a religious problem, right? It's not territorial.
Nope.
Has nothing to do with it. This is an extreme Islamic group who has tried to sell to its people that their God is upset with them because they haven't taken over the world.
And how do you fight that type of ideology?
Well, that's it.
You can't.
Right? It's religious. And
Yes.
it has been, the infidels are us, everyone else.
Yeah.
First we get rid of the Jews and then we got to come for the rest of the world.
Right.
Because we're not Islamic and we're not extreme Islamics. Because what I like to say to everybody is just because you practice the Islamic faith does not mean you're one of them.
No.
We have to make that distinction in America as well.
Yeah, there's a difference between Muslims and Islamists.
I have lots of good friends and supporters that are Muslims. They are not with the supreme leader's, narrative. So we have to be careful we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater either.
Yeah.
Which again means being informed.
Yes.
The Muslim, religion does not call for all of this.
Yes.
This is an extremist, Islamic, terrorist type of group that has hijacked their faith.
I'm glad you broke all of that down because I was at a libertarian conference recently and I had a libertarian sit with me and he's, doesn't believe we should send foreign aid anywhere, but especially not Israel. And he said to me, to be honest, I think Iran in the Middle East wouldn't hate us Americans so much if we didn't support Israel. Like if we were not supporting Israel, they just wouldn't hate us. Like they would just leave us alone. And I'm like, did you not hear the death to America piece?
No.
Like you really believe that the support of Israel is what's making Iran want to come for America? I was like, this is absurd.
Well, but again, misinformed, right?
Yes.
I love listening to all of this and reading what I read. And I say, my God, there's so much misinformation out there. No, they're coming for us.
Yeah.
I'm not saying every Muslim who lives in the Middle East or is now living in America agrees with that.
Yeah.
Which is why we have to be so careful. I hate grouping people together.
Mm.
When people say that Hispanics are all the same, I got news for everybody. I've spent a lifetime trying to explain that within the Hispanic community, we are very, very different.
Yeah.
My family's from Spain. We are so different from the other Hispanic countries and their cultures. Yes, we may share the language, but we share it in a different way as well, right?
Yes.
We speak differently. We have different accents.
When I went from Mexico to Spain, I went to Spain. I said, what are they speaking?
Yes.
It didn't even sound like Spanish. It was like so smooth. I really like the Spanish from Spain,
It's the mother tongue, right? It's Castilian. But
yes.
It doesn't matter. Like to me, it's like you can't group us all into one pocket. And I say the same about religious people, political people, every people.
Yeah.
You have to get to know people.
Yeah.
And that will then stave off all of this crazy.
From your trip in Israel, I often talk about Israel having bad PR strategy. Like our PR is the worst in the world. What do you think coming back from Israel, do you think Israel needs to focus on for their PR to make it better to the international community? What aren't Israelis showing about Israel that would help their cause? And then my second question is, do you believe they should have released the 47-minute video for everyone to view?
So, I think it's difficult for Israel, to be honest with you. I mean, they're up against the worst of odds. I'll give you an example. I had a 45-minute briefing on the humanitarian efforts that Israel is sending to the Gaza Strip. Now, I will tell you that I thought it was excessive. I'm always drawn to Golda Meir's statement, you can't negotiate with people who want to kill you. So it's a really powerful sentence.
Yeah.
But Israel feels the need to ensure, they do more to ensure that people don't die in this conflict than certainly we would ever do. I mean, they inform people ahead of time. They're sending humanitarian efforts through all kinds of avenues into the Gaza Strip. The UN, now I'm thinking the UN is telling me the truth, right? I'm thinking it's the objective, kind of force in any conflict. They're only telling us about one avenue. So it makes it look like Israel's not sending anything or really not really engaged. They're so engaged to the point where you think it's excessive.
Wow.
So you ask yourself, how can they get that message out when they have the UN sending a different message out?
Yeah.
And who's going to believe them? I think that's what they think.
Yeah.
Who's going to believe us when we tell you what we've just shown you? And I mean, it was an extensive presentation on humanitarian efforts and how they work so hard to make sure it gets there. But you have the UN saying a different story. So who do you believe? The international community is never going to believe Israel. And there's so much anti-Israel sentiment that what could they do for their PR? Look at, they're under siege from the north, from the Gaza Strip, from all of the proxies around them. I'm unclear how they have time to worry about what the rest of the world thinks.
Right, you're right about that.
I don't think the U.S. worried about PR when we went after Osama bin Laden.
No.
I know we didn't.
No.
We could have cared less. You know why? We had a natural enemy that had come and killed over 4,000 people, and we were not going to stop until we stopped them.
Yep.
So, okay, I don't know that PR is necessary. I think it's sad that we can't apply the same standards to Israel that we apply to anyone else that would have been attacked.
Yeah,
everyone has a right to defend themselves against an unprovoked attack.
Yes, absolutely.
And
even when we make a mistake, for example, I covered when we hit the aid truck on accident, and Israel came out and said that was us. We hit the aid truck. They apologized for it. They said they're opening an investigation for it, etc. What was the headline? Israel is stopping humanitarian aid and food trucks into Gaza. No, it's not true. You know, they came out and they took responsibility for hitting that aid truck, but we can't make one mistake during war. You just can't make a mistake.
Listen, it's inherent. It's sad because nobody wants to go to war.
Yeah.
There's always unintended consequences. There's always innocent lives that are lost. But I want to remind people who began this war.
Yeah.
Right. And also, you know, Hamas uses its people as their human shields.
Yeah.
They do not care about their people.
No.
I don't care what anyone says. Look, they've taken any kind of humanitarian efforts that were always sent to Gaza. They took it for themselves. They took the money. All they did was build their own tunnels at the expense of their own people. Now, I understand some of those people are in bed with Hamas.
Yeah.
So, you know, who do you trust?
Yeah.
You know, in those circumstances, it's difficult to know who to trust. But let's make no mistake. Hamas uses their women and children as their human shields. And so who's to blame if someone innocent dies? The person who put them in front. They put their operations in hospitals, schools, in community centers. What are you expecting?
Yes. And also, what are people expecting when war happens? I'm incredibly sad when I see the images that are coming out of Gaza with the children, just like I was incredibly sad of what happened to our people on October 7th. But it is a war. And I wonder if it's because this is the first time in history we are able to see it via social media. And in the past, we think of war, we hear about deaths, but we didn't really see what war looks like and what it does to people. And so I'm wondering if that is playing a role in
most definitely
people are coming out and saying it's genocide. Well,
yes.
No, there's not genocide, but yes, people are dying on both sides.
Yes.
You know,
and I think so. I recall so clearly. I grew up during the Vietnam War, and Walter Cronkite, after every one of his newscasts, at the end it was always the running total of how many soldiers had died. And I recall so clearly seeing the 50,000, you know, mark, and you would get a couple of snippets from the news people that were, you know, on the ground in Vietnam, but you had to imagine it yourself. You had to imagine what that looked like in Vietnam. You're hearing the stories. You might see a picture or two in the press. Now you see reels and reels and reels of the destruction of war. And I'm pretty sure, you know, we've seen movies that try to emulate Normandy, for instance. The number of casualties in 5 minutes was so incredible. That is war. It's unfortunate. I would love to live in a world where there is no war, right? Where we could all live peacefully together.
Yeah.
I hope and pray that day arrives. But until such time, and until we have enemies, and until we have unprovoked attacks, like those that we had in America in 9/11, you got to defend yourself, and you got to know that means that it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
I mean, if we had had news reels of World War II, I think people would have been shocked.
Yeah.
Shocked to see London. Of course we have pictures. London completely bombed.
Yeah.
It was terrifying, but it was war. And, it kind of makes me think, again, people should study, what happens in a war and how do we get here? And God, that nobody even likes it.
Yeah.
There isn't a soul that I know that I've talked to that says this is a good thing.
Yes.
It's always a bad thing.
It's always a bad thing. I spoke to a friend and he said, well, sure, I'm just anti-war. And I said, what are you trying to communicate to me, that I'm pro-war?
Yeah.
And I said, listen, we are Americans, and fortunately, I also, fortunately or unfortunately, I live in Israel and I'm experiencing my first war. But our generation hasn't experienced a war on our soil. So you have no idea what it's like to live with your enemy within your borders.
No, and that's, it's funny. I keep thinking, God forbid, should something happen here in America on our soil, where we have to worry about going outside or someone knocking on the door or someone taking us prisoner. I mean, we just are somewhat desensitized to this because we've been fortunate. We have always been a force to contend with in the world. We are the big bad force, and geography plays a big thing, right?
Yes. We have all this water.
We got a lot of water. We got a lot of forces. So we don't have to have the experience that unfortunately Israelis are having every day. And since October 7th, we now also have terrorists that are still holding hostages.
American hostages as well.
5 of them that we haven't been able to find yet. And I do believe that, it's tenuous, these negotiations. You're negotiating with a terrorist. Let's start with that, right? You're never going to negotiate with rational and reasonable people. If not, this war would have been over a long time ago and the hostages would have all been returned, including those that have died. They know that Israelis need the body back. They will not give them back because they know that they're making these Israeli families suffer.
Yeah.
Hard to sit Shiva, which is, their practice of grieving, without a body.
Yeah.
And yet they know it and they like it.
We don't have funerals without the body.
Listen,
just don't hold it.
Again, Americans should know a little bit about the Jewish faith and the Jewish culture, about how you deal with death.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to be well informed. And I don't mean this to sound as if I'm not sensitive to all of the people that are dying and the destruction in the Gaza Strip. Trust me when I tell you, I saw a bird's eye view from a plane of the destruction, and it is sad. But I want to remind everybody who started this, right? Gaza was fine. Israel was fine on October 6th. When everyone went to bed, everything seemed okay.
Yes.
And on October 7th, mayhem broke out, chaos and evil struck.
Yes.
And, this is how we find ourselves. And it's sad, but it's true. But we need to help Israel win.
Off camera, we talked about my beloved Jerusalem, and you said it's such a special city. Tell me about your experience in Jerusalem.
It's so sacred. I think that is a good word to describe Jerusalem. From the minute you arrive, you recognize it's a real religious city. The Hasidims, the very Orthodox, live there. We got there a couple of hours before Shabbat was to begin on Friday, and we went to the Shuk, which is their market, their outdoor market, and it was really quite the experience to see everyone trying to get what they need for Shabbat dinner before they had to be home and not moving, right? So I think Jerusalem speaks to all the cultures, all the religions. And I think that's what makes it so sacred, right? So much history in one place, and often in a 1 square mile. You know what I mean? There's so many stories about this incredible city that really today sort of maintains its Jewish feel very much.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just going to the wall, the Western Wall was obviously an incredible experience. Being able to pray on that wall. Understanding how every Friday this is a pattern of faith, and just going underneath the tunnels of that magnificent space. I just I just felt it's a holy and sacred place that speaks to everything that is Israel.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said it's for all the religions.
It is.
Because our Temple Mount, it says in Isaiah that it's supposed to be a place of prayer for the nations, that every person, no matter where you're from, what your background is, what your religion is, should be able to come to Jerusalem and see God and pray.
Well, and not only see him, but really be in his presence.
Yes.
There was something about Jerusalem that makes you feel as if God is everywhere. And everyone is welcome to pray there. And I certainly felt very welcomed in the city, despite the fact that I'm not Jewish. But I pray and I believe in the power of prayer. And so knowing that and being able to demonstrate that to myself was important, and to others that I was with. I mean, look, we're all faithful people, depending on, we come from different faiths.
Yes.
But we're all faithful.
Yes.
And it was really spectacular.
Yeah.
It was quite the journey. I loved Jerusalem.
What would you say was the biggest impact of your trip to Israel?
That I am going back.
Wow.
I think it has it calls you back. There's like a magnet. It was hard to leave.
Yeah.
Hard to leave, and a commitment to go back. And I was so grateful. It was my first trip to Israel, and I had so much gratitude. I felt so blessed. It was funny because most people think I've been to Israel many times because of the way that I, speak about Israel and am so pro-Israel. But it was my first trip, and I can assure you it will not be my last.
That's beautiful. Do you believe we should have more delegations to Israel?
Yes. And I couldn't believe how impactful my presence there was. People know how pro-Israel Florida is. That was really surprising, that the average Joe on the street knows that Florida supports Jews and Israel. But just being an American and being there in Israel inspires the Israelis. And I think I didn't realize that my presence alone would be so supportive.
What's one thing that you want to take from Israel to bring back to your constituency here in Florida?
I think just I want to be their eyes and ears. I don't know that anyone can imagine what I have experienced unless they do the experience themselves. So I have somewhat of a responsibility to continue to tell the story, just as I have here today. I need to be able to communicate this to my constituents.
Yeah,
it's important. I think it feels so far away, and yet it's not, and certainly not for me. So I have to tell the stories. It's my job.
Yeah. Well, Vicki Lopez, thank you so much for coming on the Black and Jewish podcast, sharing your wisdom, sharing your trip, sharing your ideals, sharing how we should be moving forward. This was such a fruitful conversation, and I just want to thank you for being a friend of Israel and the friend of Jews.
Well, and I want to thank you, because oftentimes we don't expect Black and Jewish to be in the same sentence. It's true. And I was intrigued by all of this, but I also recognize the importance of podcasts like this, Ashira. We can only, our job now is to try to reach as many people as we can to try to help inform them. I'm about freedom of thought. So after you've been informed, you can certainly choose whatever you feel, works for you. But I feel a sense of responsibility, both ethically and morally, to tell stories and to talk about this in very forthright ways to help educate people. So I want to thank you for your podcast, but also for inviting me to be a part of this very important discussion.
Thank you. And may God bless you, bless your voice, bless your eyes, bless your ears, and may you continue to be a voice for the state of Florida and a national voice as well.
Likewise for you.
Thank you. All right, you guys, that is a wrap on the Black and Jewish podcast. Please like, comment, and share. I want to hear your thoughts below. Have you been to Israel? Does this inspire you to go to Israel? What are your thoughts about October 7th? And how can we move forward together in unity? I'll see you next week.